Without further ado, I'm handing it over to Pat and Rick.
Thank you, Caleb. Good morning to all who are tuning in, and welcome. I'm from Church of the Messiah in Myrtle Beach, and I've been a member of this diocese for 26 years. And as Caleb said, Pat is the very able co-chair of this endeavor. So Pat, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Rick. You're also a very able co-chair. I am the other co-chair of the Transition Committee. I attend the Episcopal Church on Edisto, and I have been a member of this diocese for 15 years. It is really an honor, and I've gotten to do this at least one or two other times, introducing our candidates this morning. They are just all magnificent, and I've really enjoyed hearing from them this week, and I believe as you're tuning in today, you will also. So this is in no particular order, so I'll get started. Our first candidate is the Reverend Kevin Johnson. He is the rector at St. Albans Episcopal Church in Arlington, Texas.
Good morning. It's good to be with you.
The Venerable Callie Walpole, our Archdeacon from the Diocese of South Carolina. She is also the Vicar and Subdean of Grace Church Cathedral in Charleston, South Carolina.
Good morning, everyone.
The Reverend Jeffrey Hoare, he's the rector at St. Albans Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C.
Morning.
The Reverend Canon Ruth Woodliff Stanley. She's a canon for strategic change in the Diocese of Northwestern Pennsylvania and Western New York, and she's a senior vice president for strategic change in the Episcopal Church Building Fund.
Morning, everyone.
And the Reverend Canon Terrence Lee. He's a rector at St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Harlem, New York.
Morning.
Thank you again to each of you for running for this election. We're very excited about having all of you in this upcoming election. For the participants that are just tuning in, I would like to remind you that our diocesan website has a special section with materials designed to help you get to know the candidates better. And we'll be posting that link in the Zoom chat function. Before we get going, Rick and I are going to walk you through the schedule for the day. We'll start with a general overview and then get more specific toward the end.
Thank you, Pat. This morning's panel discussion will be about 2 hours in length, and we'll pause midway through for a stretch break. We'll wrap up the panel discussion just before noonday prayer, which will occur at 12:15 this afternoon. The afternoon is again an extended period of break time, and we'll reconvene again for evening prayer, which will be at 5 this afternoon. Be aware, looking ahead a little bit, something we're very pleased to have as a part of this endeavor is we'll conclude the day with Compline led by the youth of the diocese. So please stay tuned at the end of the breakout sessions for that. The morning panel discussions are being recorded. So if you miss any of these, they'll be available later through the Diocesan YouTube page and also on the Bishop Search website as soon as they can be posted. The afternoon sessions are not being recorded. We'll give further instructions about those when we get to that part of the day. And again, for technical issues or questions, do reach out to the technical folks of our diocesan staff. They can assist you. They're on hand for doing that. Pat, you have further information?
I do. I have a detailed explanation of this morning's panel discussions. Like Rick mentioned, they will be around 2 hours in duration. The questions that will be submitted to the candidates were chosen by the Transition Committee from questions that were submitted by members of the diocese. Each candidate will have between 3 to 5 minutes to answer each question in turn. The order in which the candidates will be answering was chosen at random. And now we're going to hand things over to the moderators for this morning. I'd like to introduce the Very Reverend Adam Shoemaker, the rector of St. Stephen's in Charleston, and Jeanette Spencer from Calvary Charleston.
Thank you, Pat and Rick. Good morning and welcome again to our candidates. I am Adam Shoemaker and with me is Jeanette Spencer. We are your moderators for today. For those tuning in, just a reminder that the questions we'll be asking our candidates have been selected from those that were submitted to the diocese. Each candidate will have 3 to 5 minutes to answer the question in turn, and we'll give an indication when their time is up. And I'm sure by this point our candidates are familiar with that indication. Again, the order in which you'll answer has been chosen at random, and we will begin today with Jeffrey. Our first question touches on the theme of Episcopal presence and church planting. Jeffrey, given continued population growth in our diocese, as well as the development of many new residential developments, what should our diocese do about planting new congregations? Please describe some successful strategies of church planting that you have observed and or experienced.
Well, thank you and good morning, everyone. Church planting has for a long time now been the most effective form of evangelism available to us. There are a number of issues around church planting, specifically what kind of church we're planting. We're pretty good at suburban educated congregations. We're much less good at minority, cultural difference, second language types of congregations, or even mixed congregations. I've seen various models.
She was standing by the door ready to go out.
The most common being a fairly heavy investment in priest property and program early on in the middle of a church plant. It's a question to some degree of resources, to some degree of planning, and to some degree of the right personnel with the vision and capacity to plant churches. But there's no question that that's what we should be about, especially when there is population growth. That said, I'm also interested in how we can call into being new models of Christian worshiping community other than our more traditional Episcopal parishes. And how we go about that is still something in formation in my mind, but it has to do with new power, crowdsourcing, giving people, particularly younger adults, agency, decision-making power, the ability to shape institutions. It's sort of called founders. Some people have said this generation needs to be called the founders.
What you do?
Can you hear me? Is that all right?
Yes, just a second. For everybody listening in, could you please mute yourself so that the speaker can be heard? Sorry, go ahead, Jeffrey.
Right, thank you. So I'm interested both in what I would call more traditional Episcopal church planting activities, and also in how we develop new forms of Christian, our brand or our model in quite the same degree. Be happy to say more about that if you're interested, but that's probably enough for now.
Thank you. The next respondent will be Terrence. I will ask the question again. Terrence, given continued population growth in our diocese, as well as the development of many new residential developments, what should our diocese do about planting new congregations? Please describe some successful strategies of church planting that you have observed and or experienced.
Thank you. That's an important question. Good morning. Good to be with you this morning. I've observed some positive things about church planting, but before I get to what I've observed, I would like to say a couple of things about church growth and church planting. First, we know that in many areas in our nation, the Episcopal Church is on the decline in population. But one of the things we do know, even before the schism, South Carolina was one of the fastest growing dioceses in the church. The churches that were planted along Myrtle Beach and the coast were growing at a rapid rate. And one of the things I've observed that was successful in that is giving people opportunities to worship in ways in which they would like to worship, still being Episcopalians. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we can't be all things to all people. However, there are some churches that would like to worship in a contemporary way, or there are churches that provide opportunities for people to worship traditionally and in a contemporary way. So when we look at church planting, we want to look at the communities, okay? So what I do know is that in South Carolina, around 2005, South Carolina was one of the fastest growing states among our Latinx communities. It was growing by about 5%. And even when we look at South Carolina today, in the Southern Deanery, we have about 11% Latinos. So one of the things we ought to do is look at these marginalized communities or communities that are growing in our nation. The Latinx community is growing by leaps and bounds. So there ought to be a study and to look at how we can plant Spanish-speaking congregations. How do we do that? I know we get focused on buildings, but now COVID-19 has taught us a lot. We can do church virtually. And so one of the things about planting a church is getting people gathered together via our virtual platforms. Another thing that we can look at is reimagining how we do church and how we do church planting. So it's not just planting, finding a building, finding those resources, finding the organist, and opening the doors of the church. The church starts with the community of people that are gathered together. There are churches that currently exist in areas where we could plant new churches. So we could have a community within a community. That happens a lot in New York City because it is a dense populated place and we don't have a lot of room to build new buildings. But a lot of our churches, though they have an English-speaking congregation, there is a Spanish-speaking congregation that is an entirely different community that worships in the same space, that has their own clergy that worships at a different time. Also, when we look at church planting, we want to look at and finding those clergy that are trained in church planting, that have the energy, the vibrancy, the know-how to plant churches. That is not my strength. I've never planted a church, but I have observed and studied, and I know that there are successful ways in doing so. So let's look at the Diocese of South Carolina. Let's see where the diocese is growing among a certain population. And not only are we looking at race and ethnicity, but also we have opportunities among millennials. Millennials, we have found, want a deeper spiritual worship. We knew, as what my liturgics professor would call in seminary, we have the happy clappy churches, right? Well, and we thought that the young people liked happy clappy. But there are a group of millennials that want a deeper spirituality. Let's gather them together. Let's see if there's a leader among them and they can begin to grow that population. So those are the ideas that I've observed and that I would have around church planting. One, let's look at the demographics of the community. Let's look at those communities that have been traditionally marginalized. And let's reimagine how we can plant churches. That we're not just looking at a building to put on a space, but remember, COVID-19 has taught us that we can do wonderful things virtually. Thank you.
Thank you. The next respondent is Callie. Callie, given continued population growth in our diocese, as well as the development of many new residential developments, what should our diocese do about planting new congregations? Please describe some successful strategies of church planting that you have observed and or experienced.
Thank you, Adam, for the question. And planting churches, that's really who we are in the Diocese of South Carolina at our best. I'm thinking about back in the old days when the state of South Carolina was the entire diocese, and Bishop Gary was in about 1922 was a part of the diocese petitioning General Convention to form a new diocese, the Diocese of Upper South Carolina, whose seat would be in Columbia. And Walter Edgar, the renowned South Carolina historian and Episcopalian, he's taught us that by Bishop Gary's death, by his martyrdom in 1928, the Diocese of South Carolina, our diocese with the seat in Charleston, had more than doubled. And so had the diocese was twice the size as it was when it was officially and properly divided by General Convention to form Upper South Carolina. So that's just who we are. It's part of the evangelical spirit, the evangelical Catholic spirit that all are welcomed and invited into the church. And certainly looking at areas of population growth, I think one of the first things we need to do is talk to and make use of our clergy and people who know what it takes to grow congregations. We have people within our own diocese. I'm looking at some of them right now who know what it takes to grow congregations, and we need to put them in charge. One of the successful ways we did this was, sorry, I still have a landline. One of the ways we did this was having parishes work and develop missions and have those missions be under their care until such a time as they became parishes themselves. So there are all sorts of strategies that can be put to use. But I think again, a knowledge of the need in the particular area, and recognizing that some of these congregations are going to end up becoming resource parishes themselves. Others, it may take longer. When I was a part of the church plant in Spanish-speaking ministry back in the late 90s, the idea was clear at that point that was at the beginning an outreach ministry. And so the expectation was that the diocese would support that ministry, and they did. Congregations all over the diocese readily embraced the Spanish-speaking ministry that we were starting in those days, and that wonderful congregation that was present among us. So I think this is just really exciting. We have so many places in our diocese where we have this need. So this would be a huge priority right out the gate. I could say more as well, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Callie. Up next is Kevin. Kevin, given continued population growth in our diocese, as well as the development of many new residential developments, what should our diocese do about planting new congregations? Please describe some successful strategies of church planting that you have observed and or experienced.
Good morning. Thanks for the question. And it's an important question because it not only deals with the future of the church, but it also deals, I think, with the fundamental mandate of Jesus from Nazareth, which is to go forth. So I am a church planter by formal training and practice. I've planted a Spanish-speaking congregation, and I am currently working with the New Episcopal Community Group to plant the Gathering Project. There is really no one right answer to church planting, but there are some common patterns that almost all successful church plants incorporate. There are many tools available in the Episcopal Church today. As I said, I'm involved with the New Episcopal Communities organization. We actually applied for and received funding from them, and assessment tools. There are demographic studies, a program out there called Faith X, and that's really part of the core of church planning, is to figure out what are the demographics, who's out there, and what are their propensities, what are their preferences, how do they connect with God, how do they connect with church, what are their cultural norms and patterns, and then how do we intersect with that. Church planning is really about a call, and not everybody is capable to be a church planner, but you can learn the commonalities and the processes and some of the personality traits involved in church planning. There are a lot of support systems out there. There's formal training. We know that church planning requires ongoing support, not just in terms of money. It takes about 5 years for a church really to get off base and become even at the break-even point. So, we know that up front just from historical patterns and practice. And we also know that church planners are often feel very much separated from the rest of the world. And so they require, it's a significantly stressful moment in the life of a planter. And so they require ongoing support and cheerleading and care and nurturing. And that a lot of times that support has to come from the diocesan staff level, the bishop and the supporting staff, the canon of the ordinary, and those other folks like that. The two most successful church plants I've seen, one of them is here actually in the Fort Worth area. It's actually a Disciples of Christ church. And it is an amazing place that was willing to think outside the box in terms of what does a church look like. So it's really about 3/4 what they call IRL, in real life people, and then 25% is online membership. So it's really forced them, and I've had I'm good friends with the planner and me, to really think about what does membership of a church look like today in the 21st century. And the other facility that I've seen that is very successful and really amazingly innovated is an Episcopal church just north of Houston in Spring. They actually meet in a converted warehouse, and their outreach missions are integrated into their worship space, much like St. Gregory of Nyssa integrates their food pantry, their weekly food pantry distribution into the actual worship space, which does two things. One is the people who use the outreach facilities really become an additional congregation. And if you watch the St. Gregory of Nyssa video by Sarah Miles, it's a 5-minute, you should just look it up. It's an amazing program. They talk about, oh my gosh, what it was like that day that they realized that those people who were coming in and utilizing the food pantry and volunteering and helping to run the food pantry, many of which were clients of the food pantry, were an actual congregation, not just a Sunday morning congregation. So it can be done today. It's being done successfully, and it can be done very well in every part of the nation. So,
thank you, Kevin.
Sure.
And the final respondent for this question is Ruth. Ruth, given continued population growth in our diocese, as well as the development of many new residential developments, what should our diocese do about planting new congregations? Please describe some successful strategies of church planting that you have observed and/or experienced.
Thank you. When I think about this question in light of the context of the church, I realize that it's both something that has been with us since the very beginning and something that we have found challenging in more recent eras of the church's life. I think about what Aubrey Hendricks says about the temple and the wilderness, and this idea that the closer to the temple you were in Jesus's time, the more prestige you had. And over time, being out on the edge was seen as derogatory. The wilderness is seen as this place you didn't want to go. But it's, it's precisely, as we know, where Jesus went to be prepared. And I really think about church planning as going to the wilderness, as going to the edge. And so I think it's necessary to have an edge mindset to cultivate gifts if we want to, have the kind of future that involves being bold about church planning. So we've got to have some, capacity to embrace the unknown. And I've gotten to be engaged with that in a number of times in my ministry. As rector of St. Thomas, I was engaged with House for All Sinners and Saints, a Lutheran congregation, when they were still fairly new, and they came to worship with us. And so I learned a lot about, from the pastor and the people, what it was taking, because we were two congregations. It was that kind of nested model that Terrence was pointing to. And then, yes, absolutely, around demographics. I really want to say yes, 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 yes to my colleagues again, because, these have been mentioned, but I know that we've got to, if we're going to have an edge mindset, we've got to be able to understand how to resource. And to do that, we first got to understand our context. I got a chance to do that in the Diocese of Colorado, working with Latinx missioners two missioners who were very gifted in church planting. And I worked closely with them and really learned a lot from them about differences in first generation and second, third generation church plants. We had some tremendous success, which was their success, not mine, but I was a student in that work. And so I think that understanding both the demographics and the context within a community, and then being prepared to start smart, to resource well from the diocese, and to do the necessary kind of tilling the earth so that people that need to be prepared for that work, who are in existing communities nearby, are willing and joyful partners in that work. I also would just say that I feel like we've got to think about specific needs together as a diocese, and then direct our resources toward plants in those areas. And again, other folks have pointed to this, but the missions and the plants that I've seen that have been most successful really start with a pretty specific vision based on a need in an area. So another that comes to my mind is St. Bridget's in Colorado, and there was a real awareness of a need in that community, among other things, for some housing, and they were able to leverage New Market tax credits to accompany that community with housing. I know you're already doing this work. As I've prayed with the congregations and begun to get to know you all, I've seen the church plants, and particularly those that have happened since schism that have been blossoming. So, what I've seen and what I think that you're doing already is that what makes church plants work is to understand the demographics, as we've all been saying, and then to resource well and to equip well. And the last thing I'll say is to recruit folks who are excited about this work. As Kevin's pointing to, it's a very specific call to the edge. So I think people need to understand that it has their name on it if they're going to be engaged as the leaders. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'll turn it over to Jeanette to ask our next question.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Adam. Our second question touches on the theme of diocesan priorities, background, and experience. And I'll begin this question with Kevin. Since you have come to know us a bit more during this process, what do you perceive to be the greatest challenges our diocese is currently facing? And how might your background and experience in ministry thus far help us to address them?
Yeah, thanks. Let me start with the background piece, and then we'll work forward from there. I've referred to the place, the parish that I work in now, as oftentimes as a crazy gospel experiment. And I chose purposely to go to this place. I left a much larger church to go to a half-time position, and was able to do that because I didn't really need the money, so I was blessed in that way. But I chose to go there because I was really intrigued by the challenge and the opportunities of that place. It was a displaced church out of schism, and I knew that there were some significant challenges in that and some significant opportunities. And I was truly drawn by a people who had taken significant risk of their own selves and their own lives to stand up for their values. They had given up, in many cases, buildings that they had invested whole lives in, buildings where their spouses were buried in the columbariums, to stand up for what they knew was right in terms of the gospel. So I chose to go to this place, and they taught me that they could change the world by standing up for what was right. And they taught me that with that standing up and doing this work in this crazy context, they could change each other and they could honor Christ. I taught them that that their work is really about participating in the victory of Christ to be the light in the dark, and to put into practice some ideas around growth, not just in terms of people and money, but also deep spiritual growth that I had kind of been working with and learned over the years. It was really an opportunity, kind of a blank slate place that was willing to experiment and practice. And interestingly enough, a lot of these various practices that turned out to actually work, because we doubled in size over 4.5 years, began to spill out into the diocese as we began to work with other parishes in consulting roles and through the evangelism committee. I think the biggest challenges of South Carolina is the reality that you are living in an in-between place. The parish and several parishes in the Diocese of Fort Worth had made the choice that said, you know what, we know we're in the middle of a lawsuit, but we are not going to let that stop us from being the church. And they've been the church in new and amazing and creative and effective ways. But underneath all that, always in the back of your head, is this legal limbo place. And at some point, the Diocese of South Carolina, just like we have in Fort Worth, is going to come to a fork in the road. And hopefully your fork in the road is different than our fork in the road ended up being, because we lost the legal limbo place and are now turning properties over. But either way, there's still going to be a clear moment of resurrection that will require some significant work, because you deal with grief, you deal with reconciliation, and then you become resurrected. And I think I can bring to South Carolina some clear experience, some clear spiritual and practical experience that I have been been blessed to have here for the last almost 6 years, and bring those gifts, presents, whatever it is, those practices, opportunities, to South Carolina to work on a much larger level. So I feel particularly called and am particularly intrigued by the kind of coincidences that have unfolded. So thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Jeffrey. Jeffrey, I'll repeat the question for you. Since you have come to know us a bit more during this process, what do you perceive to be the greatest challenges our diocese is currently facing? And how might your background and experience in ministry thus far help us to address them? Jeffrey?
He's having Wi-Fi issues.
Okay.
Yes, and maybe go on to the next person and we'll come
right.
back to him.
Next up is Ruth.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jeanette. I really resonate with what Kevin said about this understanding of your being in liminal space. I've really carried that with me through this process with you all. And the place in scripture that I continue to come back to is a space that's not really words, but it's a space between words. It's one of the most compelling portions of scripture to me. And I always begin with the second passage, which is in the first chapter of Joshua, when the Lord says, to Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. Get up, get going, cross this Jordan River, right? But before that, if you back up to the end of Deuteronomy, in what I think is one of the most breathtaking chapters in scripture, Moses, who has had this long life and is at the threshold of the promised land, still with a twinkle in his eye and a spring in his step, he dies there, and God alone knows where he's buried. He carries him to his burial place, and the people have to grieve. And then, there is this space between, right? There's this pivot. That's really where I think you are. And I think the greatest challenge in the days ahead is to hold both that, the letting go that still lies ahead and the grieving, together with this energy to get up and get going and cross the Jordan, which also is already present. Both of these realities you are already living into. I think that the challenge for you and your new bishop will be to continue to hold both and with some grace and skill. I believe that the work that I've done over the last 2 decades has a lot of intersection with you in this moment. I came to the Diocese of Colorado at a time when we were poised for schism, and did work with my bishop in a process we convened and created that engaged the entire diocese in exactly this kind of conversation. God is calling us to a new future, and we are sitting in a lot of pain and a lot of history that we've still got to sort through. And that also had legal dimensions, multi-million-dollar lawsuit. It had property issues, properties that were at stake, like you have experienced, parishes that were shut out of their building for a period of years, and our bishop had to spend too many days and years in courtrooms, had to wear a bulletproof vest for a period of time, and I walked alongside him in that work for really the whole arc of that. process. The wisdom that I saw in what he did was to not just get, trained to the crisis, which can happen, as we all know, and which I can see clearly that you've not done, but to run on both tracks, as it were, the Joshua 1 and the end of Deuteronomy, if you will, and to be able to really cast a vision at the same time that you're also working through these very challenging issues. I think that's going to be the work in the days ahead. And I think what will strengthen you to do that work is connective tissue, is to really make sure that the diocese is deeply connected to one another and deeply steeped in a way of being together that is grounded in prayer and in scripture study and in mutual reflection, kind of noticing together as a habit of mind and spirit. What is the Spirit doing right now on both of those tracks? And how do we keep weaving them together? Because they all are there to work for good, for the sake of the gospel. So that's what I see. And that's what I understand to be the work, that the challenges that lie ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Jeffrey is back. Great. You're up next, Jeffrey. I'll repeat the question for you.
Thank you.
Since you have come to know us a bit more during this process, what do you perceive to be the greatest challenges our diocese is currently facing, and how might your background and experience in ministry thus far help us to address them?
Thank you. I apologize for going missing. I suddenly couldn't hear.
Quite all right.
So Lauren was great about helping me sort that out. And I apologize to Kevin and Ruth. I missed the end of Kevin and the beginning of Ruth, but I'm sure it was brilliant. What I've heard from you thus far, and I'm happy to be corrected, but seems to me that the challenges I'm hearing most about revolve around congregational development and the development of resources across the board for various priorities of the diocese. And if that's right, then thinking about congregational development is something that I've been doing my entire ministry. And we know a certain amount of things about key factors for congregations. We know clarity of purpose, mission, and so on is important. We know that financial transparency and good faithful stewardship practice is important. We are increasingly learning that giving new Christians a path to discipleship that has some clarity is important. In the old days, the sort of boomer church, you wanted to give people a smorgasbord of possibilities and they would find their own place. Nowadays, people don't need a smorgasbord. They've got a smorgasbord of opportunities in life. And if they're going to invest in developing their own faith, there needs to be some clarity of how to do that. And that's a part of what's necessary. We know that congregations of any size that have a clear sort of charism for service in the community in their particular situation, however they're doing it, is important for to make manifest the gospel in word and deed. We know this and much else besides, and we can help each other talk about those things. We can do training, we can talk about metrics, we can talk about all of the things that help develop congregations. And I don't mean just grow them, although that's important. I mean develop the life of the congregation so that there's an authentic expression of the gospel, which itself will be attractive. It's not about, let's start a new service with a different genre and put an little A on the banner outside and expect people to come because we're doing something that you don't have to dress up or something like that. That if we want to start and develop community, there has to be a core community of people who care deeply in order for something to happen. In terms of developing financial resources, some of that is a matter of asking. Some of that is a matter of having clarity of what we need the resources for. I remember an old cartoon of a pastor standing next to one of those thermometers and obviously saying to a parishioner, "It would just be nice to have, that's all," you know. and that is not the way to raise funds for capital or other projects. And raising funds takes two things. One is, you know, for development and so on. And I'm not just talking about squeezing the parishes for more money. I'm talking about how do we cast a vision where we can get the resources we need in order to do the work we're given to do. And that kind of fundraising requires two things. It requires constant teaching of the practice of generosity, which is about our need to give. It is about our need to be generous. It is about our need to both sustained and sustaining generosity of the kind we do with pledging, and the kind of generosity we do that's more ephemeral or response to particular needs or capital appeals or whatever. And so constant teaching of the importance of that spiritual practice for the Christian community and for us individually. And then also a degree of urgency. Things need to be urgent, obvious, and compelling. So let's say, just take the last question, let's say we needed resources for church planting and we don't have them otherwise in the diocese. Then let's talk about how we raise that. And it needs to be urgent, obvious, and compelling, where people can see the need and hear the passion and feel the intensity and are able to respond. So that's what I'm hearing is congregational development and financial resourcing for the mission of the diocese is seems to be what's most on your minds, along with healing and whatnot, but that's enough for now. Thank you. It's a great question.
Thank you. Next up is Terrence, and I'll repeat the question. Since you have come to know us a bit more during this process, what do you perceive to be the greatest challenges our diocese is currently facing? And how might your background and experience in ministry thus far help us to address them?
Thank you. There are many challenges to any diocese. The challenges that South Carolina faces, many of the challenges are similar because we're facing them in the Episcopal Church. But there are some unique challenges to South Carolina that I'd like to speak about. One, the first challenge is that we are living in a polarized nation. We're living in a polarized nation that is dealing with issues of justice and issues of injustice. You are a diocese in the Deep South. And so how do we exist to be the Episcopal Church in South Carolina, dealing and living in a nation that is polarized? There were a lot of questions last night about the bishop's role as being a public theologian and whether or not the bishop would be involved in politics. That's what I was hearing. So that's one thing I'd like to say, that the question is, how do we be the church during these times? That's a challenge for any diocese. That's a unique challenge to the Diocese of South Carolina because you have been without leadership for some time. And so when an organization, the church, an individual parish, or a diocese is without leadership, then the challenge is where are we going? Because we are a church that needs a leader. We're a church, we have a rector or a priest in a pastor in a congregation. What I hear this diocese needs is you are ready to call a pastor to bring some healing and reconciliation to this diocese. The diocese is grieving. There are those in the diocese who are hurt. The schism is real. You have been, and we have been affected by that. We have relatives and friends that are worshiping. In Edisto, you are right across the street from one another, where you probably remember worshiping in the old church or the church that has split, and those who have remained with the Episcopal Church. So how do we be the church for such a time as this? That's the biggest challenge. Having a pastor in the bishop that will deal with vision and also bringing back spiritual vitality and worship to the diocese. Our clergy feel disconnected. Why? Because there's no leader. When there's a vacuum in the leadership, then we are left to our own devices. So one of the biggest challenges for the bishop, whomever she or he is, when elected, will have to work about bringing reconciliation, not just about bringing the churches that have left back. That's not the main focus, but bringing a sense of unity and reconciliation to the diocese. Bringing back worship and how we worship, having a vision, being in the diocese, how to be the church in this time, justice work. There is a time to mourn, there's a time to laugh, there's a time to live, there's a time to die. Some things probably have already died, relationships. How do we revive those? How do we grow and bring the vitality back? How do we take our charge of being the Episcopal? And I keep saying that because there are other churches that look like us in South Carolina, that call themselves Episcopal, that call themselves Anglican. But what is our identity? What will make us different from those churches in our community? And that is that we are the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of South Carolina, being welcoming. So let me get to my experiences with that. I have had experiences in churches where I have become the rector after a long vacuum in leadership. And yes, all of the temporal things that we need to deal with in the church are important. Fundraising, taking care of the property, administration, personnel, all of those things we deal with, and we have to, and any leader will have to deal with those things. But what I'm very clear about is that when there has been a vacuum in leadership, whether it be the church or a diocese, one of the most important things and challenges to that institution or that community is that there needs to be a sense of bringing back some unity and having a vision so that we are all moving in the same direction. So that St. Catherine's is not moving in a different direction. My experience has helped me to do that with congregations, and it will help me to do that in the church with you.
Thank you, Terrence. And the last person is Callie. And I'll repeat the question for you, Callie. What do you perceive to be the greatest challenges our diocese is currently facing? And how might your background and experience in ministry thus far help us to address them?
Well, one of our challenges, and we have many, one of our great challenges is to confront our exclusive and racist past as a diocese, to deal with that, not to burden one another, but to be freed to move forward into a bright future, to confront these matters courageously and to learn and grow so that we can move forward. And that does require listening and openness. Another challenge, a tremendous challenge, and Jeffrey touched on this, actually spoke very eloquently about it, is we need to build up our congregations for the work of the gospel. We need to resource our congregations. We need to plant new congregations. We need to build up the people of God, clergy and the congregations, and to do that hard work. We have so many congregations, whether they be the remnant congregations, the missions that formed after the rupture in 2012, or a number of our long-standing missions that have been absolutely neglected over many long years. And so there's been a lot of neglect, and so pastoral care and also not just words and not even just presence, but actual resourcing congregations that need need the help and growth. Another area that is a challenge for us is I'm not really sure how well we know one another. And so when we don't know one another well, we don't always trust one another well. And when there is a lack of leadership, which there has been for quite some time that Terrence talked about, then I think all sorts of perceptions about one another can develop. Mistrust can develop. We all go off, people go off into their own little corners and do their ministry. And guess what? The body of Christ suffers. And we are really better than that at our core, I believe, as people of God here in South Carolina. And so I think allowing ourselves to get to know one another, the bishop would need to be at the forefront of that in the promotion of that sort of unity, of course, and then allowing the Lord to use us as the Lord so sees fit to build up. There's been a lot of tearing down in those years leading up to the rupture, and then even during the last 8-9 years. It's time not to tear down, but to build up one another. So I also think that there's some fear. I think we need to learn how to trust not only one another, but trust God. To learn how to risk again. This Lord who has called us to the cross. And so we are called into death as well. And we have a history in this diocese of rising from the ashes of whether it be war, fire, pestilence. This is not the first time we've faced division. So the challenges are many, but I believe the people of God in our diocese are up for those many challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Callie. I see that it's now 10:53, so we will be taking a break right now and returning at 11:10 a.m. Please be reminded that you can switch off your video feed, and we'll see you at 11:10. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. We will resume with our third question for this morning. And the first respondent will be Callie. The third question touches on the theme of socio-political climate. Callie, given the divisive political and social climate of our times, how do you see yourself leading our diocese toward a model that fosters unity while recognizing profound differences?
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. It's an excellent question. I think recognizing that we have to unflinchingly, unfailingly be the people that we've been called to be in the church, and that we are part of a church that is broad enough and must be broad enough to encompass within its communion every living human soul. That we are a diocese who gave up one of our bishops to martyrdom. This cause of justice and inclusion is worth it to us, no matter where it takes us. And I was just talking a few minutes ago that road leads us to the cross, and that's who we are. And I think that our next bishop will need to understand that and be willing to sacrifice in that arena. And so I also think that it's very important, speaking of the political climate and the variety of views, that we not assume that everyone in our diocese votes in one particular way. That's another form of exclusion. And so we've got to be very, very mindful of that. I've said before that I can recall early in my ministry, early in my priestly ministry, sometimes preaching sermons, and it was very obvious that my preaching was to the choir, because sometimes I and the other clergy, we actually would receive applause. And while that maybe felt a little affirming in the moment, what it meant was everyone agreed. We were a like-minded group. And Christ does not call us to serve and exist in a world of like-minded individuals, because we're poorer for that. And so I love to read St. Paul's letters, just the verbal gymnastics, the wrestling, the obvious wrestling that he goes through, trying to be prophetic, to speak the truth, yet also because he so desperately and dearly loves his people, he never loses that pastoral side as well. And so there's that wonderful and delicate dance between the pastoral and the prophetic. And so that's the community that we have here in South Carolina. And if we don't recognize that, then what people will do is they won't challenge us. They will simply exit the scene. They'll do what good Episcopalians do when they don't agree. They'll vote with their feet. They'll leave. They'll vote with their pocketbooks, and all of a sudden they'll be gone, and we'll wonder what happened, or we might not even notice. But again, we will have lost a segment of our society. Somebody who was very, very instructive for me in my own walk has been Angelina Rimke. And when I was in seminary in 2003, and I had lots of lots of elderly priests who were reaching out to me, serving as mentors, and were encouraging me to run as fast as I could away from South Carolina. And all one has to do is read the letters of Angelina Grimke to see how saddened she was at having left South Carolina, and none of her appeals to the Christian women of the South or to the clergy of the South on the issue of slavery, none of her brilliant prophetic appeals were ever read by the very people to whom she was writing, because the mobs would gather up the pamphlets and burn them. There would be big bonfires. So we have to be able to speak to people where people can hear us. And that's a huge challenge, but also a marvelous one, in my view.
Thank you, Callie. The next respondent will be Ruth. Ruth, I'll repeat the question. Given the divisive political and social climate of our times, how do you see yourself leading our diocese toward a model that fosters unity while recognizing profound differences? Ruth, you're muted.
So sorry about that. Thanks. For me, the answer ending of what's at the heart of the gospel, and specific, as Callie was just speaking about, the letters of St. Paul are a great thing, the work day where there would be a meeting going on, or the Commission on Ministry, or the Property and Finance Committee. I would always say, this is where I'm going. Would you like to come? And every now and then, we would have a couple of folks come. Sometimes people would be taken aback, but that was just a teachable moment. I really believe that that's a starting point, is to form folks in that understanding. I also think that we need to recover the capacity to talk to each other across our lines of difference effectively. There are some wonderful models for that. They're not all in the church, but there are some great models I've been practicing and learning from that I would be excited to bring, should I be called to walk with you. And they have to do with us just getting in our living rooms together and, getting away from this sort of concept of single identity politics that drives further division. And it takes real courage and stamina to really try to go to the root. Why? And it takes curiosity. Why do you believe that? Why is that your position? We've bought into a kind of politeness and a kind of cheap peace. So I would want to invite us to forego that approach in favor of creating brave and courageous spaces together. And we have a lot of partners that are doing that in race justice, in issues around poverty and economic justice, and all manner of key issues we must face. Thank you. I see there's time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. The next respondent is Kevin. Kevin, given the divisive political and social climate of our times, how do you see yourself leading our diocese toward a model that fosters unity while recognizing profound differences?
Thanks. I guess I want to begin by recognizing that there has been a lot of free-floating stress and anxiety in these last several years, last decade plus, really. And in many ways, it's like secondhand smoke. I don't know if you remember when restaurants used to allow smoking inside, and you couldn't, even if you didn't smoke and didn't participate in that, you still absorbed that. And I think we've all been absorbing a lot of the free-floating anxiety that has floated around our culture these last many years. So it's real. I think part of the role of any leader of any organization, and particularly a diocesan bishop, is that there is a impetus, a necessity to create a climate that acknowledges that there are a variety of people. It's really what Elizabeth talked about when she talked about the state at prayer, which is a core fundamental ethos of what it is to be Anglican. The state here representing everybody in the nation. And how do you create a big enough tent, a safe enough place, so that everybody can come together in prayer? The state at prayer. To not create that kind of climate, to not foster that kind of climate, sets people up for feeling like they're invisible and not worthy, which to me seems antithetical to the gospel of Christ. So I will just say that myself personally, having spent some of life on both sides of the proverbial political fence, I guess what I've discovered is that the idea of a clear dividing line is a shorthand myth that doesn't reflect the reality of most people. When it comes to political positions, most people are a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit over there. I myself am all over the map in different areas, and my observation of other people shows that I'm not alone. To pigeonhole people into one-dimensional thought is, I think, the beginning of not communicating, and not communicating is the beginning of the end of being in relationship. On the same hand, it is clear to me that relationship, healthy relationship, is grounded in the principles, ethos, and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. And those principles, ethos, and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth really are in line with the story of biblical justice. How do we truly respect and value everybody, even those people with whom we disagree? How do we have an attitude of believing, truly believing that they have something that I need? One of my favorite biblical stories is the story of the Good Samaritan, because what it teaches me is that it forces me to ask the question, as an insider, which I am, what am I not seeing? What I've discovered is that if we can stay grounded in the principles, ethos, and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, that kind of gives us a safe place, a safe base to continue having hard conversations. I don't know if when you were a kid, if you remember playing freeze tag. At least in my elementary school, you could go back to base and you could count to 10 and get catch your breath a little bit, get a little rest before you went back out into the game. I think if we can find that groundedness of the principles, it's kind of like base and freeze tag. We can go back to there, we have that in common, and then we can go back to the hard conversations. We have to have the conversations. Pretending that differences don't exist just makes them festering wounds, and festering wounds turn into gangrene, and eventually limbs get cut off when you have gangrene. So, thanks.
Thank you. The next respondent to this question will be Jeffrey. Jeffrey, given the divisive political and social climate of our times, how do you see yourself leading our diocese toward a model that fosters unity while recognizing profound differences?
Well, it might be useful to share how I've been doing it. Obviously, I'm in that blissful foretaste of eternity known as Washington, D.C., and I'll let you be the judge. Eternity in which place? Everyone in the swamp is feeling a little drained these days. I'm serving a congregation that can sometimes appear to be full of like-minded people, but isn't. So here's, and I talked a bit about this with one of the breakout groups last night, so if it's repetitive for you, I apologize. But it seems to me there are a couple of things that I and we, my colleagues, have been doing consciously to try and navigate these waters. And one is to keep teaching the core spiritual practices of Christian community, which we talk about as worship, turning toward that which is of ultimate worth, letting it shape our lives, generosity and service. And encouraging that wherever we find ourselves in terms of political decisions and choices, that we keep working on that together. At the same time, we've found in a number of ways to encourage the kinds of conversations, sometimes informal programs like Sacred Ground, sometimes not, and sometimes with some good effect and sometimes not, and not usually because people select out of the possibilities of engaging across difference, but seeking to get to a point where we recognize, accept, and even ideally appreciate difference. That's really problematic when we don't agree on truth. And that piece I haven't found a way to deal with. One of the obviously places where people experience the dissonance most fully is from the pulpit. And you might recall that some months ago, our presiding bishop and Jim Wallace of Sojourners were among the leaders who tried to start a movement called Reclaiming Jesus. And they put out a manifesto. And the manifesto was a series of arguments, biblical arguments about political issues. And the assumption of that manifesto was that we care about the Bible, and the Bible makes arguments that should change the way we think. And my experience is that that is completely misguided, that what happens once we hear something we don't like, a visceral tribal thing kicks in, and all the argument in the world is not going to change it. So we have consciously attempted to preach parable, story, particularly biblical stories, in a way that allows people who might not like what they suspect they're hearing, but can at least hear it in the same room without feeling the need to leave. It's an art that I'm really having to learn about myself, because it's not been my natural. I've got an associate who's brilliant at it, and I like listening to her. Emily Griffin is her name. She's really, really talented at this, and all of us are trying to learn how to speak in that way. So proclaiming the gospel, doing all we can to make sure the invitation to the Lord's table is open to all. Speaking in parable when possible. Not being shy about who we are, but not assuming. At one point I had to actually, I cautioned the entire parish about assuming that everybody in the room felt and believed the same way that they did, including the senior warden, who apologized, because it's so easy to alienate people without even knowing we're doing it. Kevin talked about our own blind spots. So that's how I've been trying to do it, and it works to a very large degree. It's not perfect, and that's how I would expect to start, at least in the Diocese of South Carolina, should you call me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And the last respondent for this question will be Terrence. Terrence, given the divisive political and social climate of our times, how do you see yourself leading our diocese toward a model that fosters unity while recognizing profound differences?
For the last 10 years of my ministry, I've served in New York City, a very diverse community. Served in the Diocese of Long Island. Now I'm serving in the Diocese of New York and Harlem. Harlem is one of the most diverse places in America, believe it or not. It's a cosmopolitan place, various people from various nations. In New York, we speak 140 some odd languages. I've been in the place of diversity. I've not only lived in those places, but I live that out in my ministry. My very first congregation, as you know, was in Bennettsville, South Carolina, where I was the one person of color as the rector of the parish, and then moved into St. John's in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a diverse corporate-sized parish, which was the cathedral of the diocese. But I want to talk about the parish at St. Gabriel's in Hollis, Queens. When I was there, my very first sermon that I preached going into that community was titled this. I know it's a little hokey, but it was Unity in the Community. Think about that, unity in the community. Now, I was preaching to people that looked like me. They all had the same skin tone, but they were very different. I had people from all over the Caribbean. I had people from Africa, African Americans. I had white people. It was one of the most diverse parishes that I ever served in. So what will I do as your bishop? First, we must realize that divisions will happen. That's the reality of any leader. Conflict happens. Division is real. If we look at the Acts of the Apostle at the beginning of the church, what was the first division that they had? The first argument was around whether or not people should be circumcised. So from the beginning of our history as Christians, we have been dealing with issues that have divided us. That will not go away. So as your bishop, what I will focus on and what is it that will unite us as God's people? Minnesota right now is having a racial issue. We know that police brutality is real. What should the church say about that? And maybe the question for us is this: what could the clergy and the leaders, the Episcopal bishop there, coming together with the Catholic bishop, the Lutheran bishop, and the bishop of other denominations come together to speak on these issues? We can't speak up and speak out on every issue. But as we talked about last night, the bishop should be a prophetic witness and a public theologian. So what unites us? We ought not be afraid of conflict. Division happens. But what unites us is the gospel of Jesus Christ, love of neighbor. What hurts you hurts me. So as the leader of the diocese and your bishop, I would see myself listening more, making people feel welcome, making people feel included in the diocese, showing hospitality to the marginalized, and then speaking to those who feel like they are not included. But I want to speak very clearly to the realities of ministry. You know, and I know as a rector, that there will be people that leave. You experience that in South Carolina. I have experienced that in every congregation that I have served. With new leadership, sometimes people leave. That happens and that is real. And I want to speak to the realities of ministry here today with you. And so we work toward unity, but conflict is real. I will be a bishop that will not be afraid to deal with conflict. I will be a bishop that will not triangulate. I will be a bishop that will work with the clergy. I will be a bishop that will listen to those who differ with me. I do that now in my ministry. I will be a bishop that's not afraid to call some clergy person or laity that might be angry about what is going on. And I will be a bishop that will not be afraid of criticism. That's the kind of leader that I am. But I will always be a bishop that will listen and make decisions not for self, but out of love for the diocese and the church.
Thank you, Terrence. Now I'll turn it over to Jeanette to ask our fourth question.
Thank you, Adam. Our fourth question touches on the theme of smaller congregations, and our first respondent will be Terrence. Small congregations in our diocese are often under-resourced. Some in the outlying areas, especially away from the most populated coast, at times feel disconnected from the life of the diocese. Can you suggest ideas and strategies that you have seen or initiated that would not only encourage, but also empower smaller congregations?
Yes,
Terrence.
thank you. Thank you so much for that. This is an important question because I've served those kinds of congregations. I've served in the PD. I served in the PD in a place where people, the churches in the PD, I have felt abandoned by the diocese in some ways. We are the PD, those churches in the PD in Florence and in Bennettsville, Marlborough County, in Dillon, those churches in that area are about 2 to 3 hours away from Charleston, from the Sea City. So I have a lot of ideas about how we can support these churches. One is talking about how we define those churches, as I've said before. We currently call them mission churches, or missions. For me, that puts them in a second-class status. I, as your bishop, would refer to churches that are struggling, that need financial support as aided parishes. So let's talk about the terminology. Also, I believe that for the first, I don't know, we can talk with the trustees and the standing committee on this, but we ought to give churches full voice, full vote, and the same amount of delegates to the convention. These churches are doing the real work of ministry. To say to a church like a mission church in the outlying areas, you get 1 delegate while a parish gets 2 delegates. What does that say to those churches? It says that they are second class. We have no second class people in the economy of God. And just because a church does not have the financial means to support themselves does not mean that they are not successful and they are viable. Some of these churches are the only churches in their community that is the Episcopal presence. I was the only Episcopal presence. St. Paul's in Bennettsville was the only Episcopal presence in Marlborough County. St. David's in Chiraw at the time when I was in the diocese speaking was the only Episcopal presence in Chiraw and in that county of Chesterfield. And so we have to have support. Now we can look at unique ways of giving support. We have to reimagine how we support these congregations. But how do we empower them? First, we give them equal status. We make them feel full citizens and members of the diocese and do not refer to them as second tier, especially in a diocese that is trying to rebuild and come back together, a diocese that has to deal with reconciliation. How do those clergy feel? They are clergy. They do the same work as the rector of a large parish. Believe you me, I know because I've served those parishes. I serve a large parish today that has funds, but I've served parishes that have not had funds to pay me. And so I understand the realities of that. So how would I can you suggest ideas and strategies that you have seen or initiated? Well, one of the things that we can do is yoke those parishes, right? Or those aided parishes with churches in the area, if that is possible. How can we pair them with other parishes? Also, let's talk about shared ministry together, moving beyond our Episcopal denomination. But how can a small parish work together with a parish or a church of another denomination to do the ministry that is needed in the community? Another thing is empowering and training of the clergy, giving the clergy person the tools they need to do the work in those parishes. And let's look at the laity, because sometimes those parishes do not have clergy and cannot afford clergy. So let's look at raising up laity that are strong leaders and support the laity there. And finally, the bishop needs to be present. I have experienced the bishop coming to the outlying areas for their visit, and in 2 hours, they're gone back to the Sea City. I have a home in Chiraw. My wife is from Chiraw. I can imagine going into these outlying areas and spending 3 or 4 days with them. I've already talked to my children about daddy being away for a couple of days. Why? because instead of just going in for my pastoral visit and running back down to Charleston, because see, I am aware of how that feels to people in those churches. I will go there and spend time. So imagine if you know that your bishop is coming for a pastoral visit and he's going to come the day before, or she will come the day before, spend a few days with you, do the pastoral visit on Sunday, and stay on Monday or Tuesday to go out to lunch with you, to see the area, and also to talk with other leaders of other churches in that area, because the bishop will be the Episcopal presence in that community. Those are some of the.
Thank you, Terrence. Our next respondent will be Callie, and I'll repeat the question. Small congregations in our diocese are often under-resourced. Some of the outlying areas, especially away from the more populated coast, at times feel disconnected from the life of the diocese. Can you suggest ideas and strategies that you have seen or initiated that would not only encourage, but also empower smaller congregations?
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Great question. And we talked a little bit about this last night in our breakout rooms, but my heart is in small communities. I had the privilege of spending the afternoon in Heavenly Rest Estill the other afternoon as we're trying to reawaken that congregation. And I also we talked last night about those are places, and I've said this for a while, sort of tongue in cheek, but we know the realities of climate change, and so I've said tongue in cheek, we really do need to build up places such as Heavenly Rest Estill and Holy Communion Allendale and All Saints Hampton, because they may be our coastline in 75 years. They're a little bit inland, and this is not. Well, that may have been a far-fetched notion at one point. It's not necessarily a far-fetched notion today. I think we've got to look beyond the moment. It's so easy to look to get stuck in the moment, but we've got to look beyond ourselves. And I think the diocese, through leadership in the past, through clergy, through people who had vision. I love to use the two examples of St. Stephen's Charleston back in and Adam, certainly he's written the history of it. But certainly St. Stephen's Charleston at one point, a generation ago, was in danger of closing and the property being sold. That was a real possibility. A group of clergy and strong lay people stepped in and said, let's give this a go. The same thing happened at Holy Cross Faith Memorial, Pawleys Island. That property that church was in danger of closing and the property being sold, valuable property right there on both sides of Highway 17. The actual marsh property across the highway from Faith Memorial, as you likely know, was sold. So we lost that. There are houses on that stretch right now, right next to the churchyard. And so, but think about that. Investments were made back in the day in both of those places. Now Holy Cross Faith Memorial and St. Stephen's Charleston are two of the strongest parishes in our entire diocese. But that required people looking beyond themselves, and also a priest by the name of Alan Houghton who stepped in both of those places, along with others. We've got to provide clergy support, the envisioning of quiet days and gatherings around the diocese. I think I said this in a group that regular Eucharist is very important to me. It's how I'm nourished in part. And so I can certainly see anytime I'm around during the week that scheduling Eucharist and inviting folks, the bishop needing, as Terrence said, to be present in the communities of our diocese and to be to value these places, to empower lay leadership. I know of several lay people who they either need to be ordained as soon as possible, or we need to license them as lay leaders in their congregations. They're already doing the work. We need to recognize the work in the ministry that they are already exercising. So there are all sorts of marvelous opportunities for us to value and empower and equip our smaller congregations. I've said it on numerous occasions. It's been a number of our longstanding mission congregations that have been the ones who have been sorely neglected, not only the last 8 or 9 years, but years before that as well. And so, so we have a lot of work to do to reinvigorate these congregations and support them in all the ways that we possibly can.
Thank you. Our next respondent is Jeffrey, and I will repeat the question. Small congregations in our diocese are often under-resourced. Some in the outlying areas, especially away from the most populated coast, at times feel disconnected from the life of the diocese. Can you suggest ideas and strategies that you have seen or initiated that would not only encourage, but also empower smaller congregations?
Yes, thank you. I'm in my 4th diocese, and I have not been in a diocese where this is not a reality at some level. It's either Atlanta and everywhere north of it, or it's north and south in North Carolina, Charlotte and Raleigh, or it's Northern Virginia versus Richmond, on and on and on. And small parishes and large parishes, minority parishes and white parishes. The feeling is, it's all over the place, and then the reasons for it are many and varied. But looking specifically at your situation in South Carolina and smaller parishes inland, I'd want to affirm everything that my colleagues have said. What I have seen work when it works, and it doesn't always work, because sometimes the best intent and the best actions don't change the feelings. But bishops being present, spending time, recognizing what's going on, affirming, on and on and on, bringing the diocese there. I love Kelly's thing about retreats and those things, quiet days. Those can happen bring the diocese to the inland from time to time. All of those strategies are important. But I think underlying it all comes this business of recognizing and celebrating. It's not unlike what we talk about with each other. Recognize, appreciate, and celebrate difference. You remember that old book by Lyle Schaller, may he rest in peace, The Small Church is Different, and the particular charisms. I think I shared, I'm not sure if I shared in the large group or in one of the breakout rooms, but I have a coaching client who felt that the bishop came to visit and didn't even celebrate the fact that they're not just a failing backwater. There's growth going on in the church. It's a small church. It's a vibrant church. There's ministry going on. And so part of it is how the bishop can celebrate with the congregation when present. But part of it is how to raise up all ministries in the diocese over a period of time so that these congregations and their work gets recognized for what it is, as a vital sign of the gospel, usually coming out of best practices from which others, including large congregations, can learn. So the strategies are important, but underlying the feeling of disconnect is something more to do with the human condition that we have to address by making manifest the gospel and realizing that it's a human reality that we all want to be recognized and appreciated and affirmed and raised up. And that has to be a conscious thing on the part of many, but especially the bishop. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next respondent is Ruth, and I'll repeat the question. Some congregations in our diocese are often under-resourced. Some in the outlying areas, especially away from the most populated coast, at times feel disconnected from the life of the diocese. Can you suggest ideas and strategies that you have seen or initiated that would not only encourage, but also empower smaller congregations?
Thanks, Jeanette. The first time that I had the opportunity to serve a small congregation was actually two congregations that were yoked. Years ago, when I was a new priest in Mississippi, I served as a long-term supply or interim for St. Mark's, St. Christopher's. St. Mark's is an historically African-American church, and St. Christopher's predominantly Caucasian. And the bishop asked me to serve for a season. And what I learned from the lay leaders there was that there was a profound sense of being invisibilized. And, it was an intersectional issue, of course, because there were issues around unexamined racism. But there was also this sense of their being not seen because of how small they were and struggling. Even already as early adopters of a creative initiative to be yoked. And I had some conversations over a period of time with them about what needed to happen. And we began some conversations which led to some changes in the diocese there. From those days, I carried those learnings to Colorado and served another congregation, also small, not as small, but also struggling. And then later in my work in the Diocesan office, I continued to see the need for gathering and for resourcing, and resourcing in a way back to what we were talking about earlier, that really recognizes our oneness. So really looking at how we share diocesan resources. And that's the work that when I've been able to be part of it, I've seen it really bring some hope. So we've done some work here and also in the partnership that I'm serving now in gathering by affinity, so gathering congregations that are small in size, just defined by ASA, to share resources and ideas. And then out of that, making some decisions about how we can resource them. And that resourcing has taken several forms, and this does bring hope. One form is partnering. I say, yes to my colleagues who've gone before in this answer and talked about partnering with both other congregations as well as other denominations. So we've seen some successful partnerships across denominational lines. And then financial resourcing through things like mission-driven grants. I'm not talking about mission, I liked Terrence's comment about language shift, but I'm talking about creative missional initiatives and grants that excite folks, particularly in small contexts, because it gives real opportunity to be at the table on key issues of ministry and mission. But then the last piece I really want to focus on a bit, and others have named this too, is presence, and specifically Episcopal presence as a way of modeling the importance of our being present to one another. And so, I've been thinking some about what that looks like in the church writ large, but I think it really, particularly is important to look at with small places, because sometimes we think a small patch is not a valuable patch. And the image that I sit with comes from my favorite movie of the last year, which is My Octopus Teacher. And this diver, if you haven't seen it, in off the Cape of South Africa, goes to one patch every day that's protected by a kelp forest. And he says, people thought I was kind of crazy. Why do I keep going back to the same small patch? And he said, at first it all looked the same, but as I stayed there, I started seeing the beauty and the mystery and the richness. I think that's what we're talking about with a bishop being present, is to keep coming back and seeing with the people and modeling this way of being attentive on the edge of our seats to see the beauty. I think that's what we're talking about with small churches, but I also think that's what we're talking about with a diocese. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Kevin, you're up. Okay, I'll repeat the question for you. Small congregations in our diocese are under-resourced. Some in the outlying areas, especially away from the more populated coast, at times feel disconnected from the life of the diocese. Can you suggest ideas and strategies that you have seen or initiated that would not only encourage, but also empower smaller congregations?
Thanks. That's a critical question. And I hope you can hear me. I had to put my ear pods on because they're working next door. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay, great. There's a lot of hammering going on next door. So here's what I know, that the health of the whole organization is dependent on the health of all the pieces of the organization. And here's the other thing that I have discovered, is that it is a myth that small equals non-vibrant. Small does not necessarily equal non-vibrant or non-faithful. In fact, my observation and experience, having worked with small rural congregations in Eastern North Carolina, I mean, I was almost as far as you could get away from the flagpole into the tobacco fields, is that smaller churches, the people in smaller churches, oftentimes are comprised, the churches are comprised of parishioners who work, give, and participate in the life of the church at greater rates than the average person in a large resource congregation. And I think sometimes we forget that. And I think Ruth is exactly right, that oftentimes the feeling is that we are non-existent, which is not a good feeling, like we're invisible. So I think part of this piece is to purposefully, systemically recognize, thank, go out and hear the stories, go out and record the stories of the work that is going on by the faithful people in small parishes, and bring those stories back to everybody else. Some of the best learnings I have gotten, some of the most useful tools I have received have not come from large corporate-sized churches, but have come from smaller churches that are out in rural areas. Because churches that are out in rural areas have learned to be creative and to work outside the box and to make things happen in ways that those of us who have been in larger resource churches haven't had to work so hard to figure out. I think Terrence is right. A lot of it is simply about presence, being present. It's the leadership of being present with people and paying attention to people. And yeah, you know, I've been in one of those places where the bishop blew in for about an hour and a half and then left as fast as he could. I watched his Buick drive off down the dirt road back to San Antonio. And that, you know, and what I really wanted at that moment was just to go have lunch with my bishop. I didn't need anything fixed. I didn't need anything from it. I would strive. Yeah, Terrence is right. I mean, it's about being present and staying with people and hearing stories and sharing stories